Senator, where is the proof? The day Adam Schiff finally faced a reckoning, he had spent 3 long years assuring the American public he possessed smoking gun proof of collusion. Today, however, the FBI director arrived armed with documentation of his deception. The air inside the Senate Judiciary Committee hearing room hung heavy with the scent of stale mahogany and nervous energy. Under the clinical glare of C-SPAN's lighting, the atmosphere felt harsh and unforgiving, exposing every bead of sweat and twitch for high-definition history. Every anxious gesture was captured instantly, destined to become immortalized in internet memes. Senator Adam Schiff occupied the elevated dais, projecting the kind of unearned confidence politicians display when they believe they control the script. At 64, the senior member of the Judiciary Committee and freshly minted senator from California sat tall, despite having been formally censured by his peers just months prior. He had specifically demanded this oversight hearing, eager to interrogate the new FBI director regarding the alleged politicization of federal law enforcement. In reality, his true motivation appeared to be nothing more than a desire for political revenge. Kash Patel sat alone at the witness table beneath the dais, radiating a calm intensity with 3 manila folders organized before him like loaded magazines. The 44-year-old had served as FBI director for 6 months and was the very man who helped unravel the Russia collusion narrative Schiff had championed for years. He had been waiting for this exact moment, not merely hoping for it, because he knew Schiff's ego would not allow him to stay away. The gallery behind him was packed to capacity, filled with standing spectators, journalists, activists, and curious citizens who sensed this session might turn explosive. Democrats sat on one side, anticipating the chance to see Patel struggle under pressure. Republicans sat on the other, harboring the quiet knowledge that Patel had done his homework. The committee chairman banged the gavel to bring the room to order. Schiff launched immediately into his prepared remarks, his voice carrying that familiar mix of moral superiority and rehearsed indignation that had played so well on cable news. Director Patel, there are grave concerns that you are turning the Bureau into a partisan weapon. It appears you are utilizing your authority to settle scores against critics of the former administration. Can you offer this committee any assurance that these actions will stop? Patel interrupted him, polite and professional, yet his voice sliced through the air with undeniable authority. Senator Schiff, before we address my tenure, may I ask you a single question? The room fell instantly silent as Schiff blinked in confusion. This was not how witnesses were trained to behave in these proceedings. This is my time, Director, and you will answer when I instruct you to. Certainly, Senator, Patel replied with the casual demeanor of a man ordering his morning coffee. I can wait, but considering I have waited 3 years to ask you this, a few more minutes is irrelevant. Schiff attempted to regain control and continue his scripted attack. As I was stating, you have launched investigations that appear to be partisan in nature. Patel's voice cut through again, remaining professional but now carrying a sharp edge that commanded the room's full attention. Senator, you spent 3 years claiming you had seen concrete evidence of Russian collusion. It was evidence that Special Counsel Mueller never located, and evidence that Special Counsel Durham proved never existed. He paused, allowing the silence to hang heavy in the air between them. Where is your evidence, Senator? Schiff's confident smirk faltered, flickering for just a fraction of a second. Schiff tried to pivot the conversation away from the trap. Director, let us discuss your specific qualifications for holding this office. Gladly, Patel replied, opening his first folder with the deliberate precision of a man who knew exactly what cards he held. I served as senior counsel to the House Intelligence Committee, where I investigated the origins of the Russia probe under Chairman Nunes. That means I am fully aware of the exact intelligence you had access to as the ranking member and later as chairman. He looked Adam Schiff dead in the eye. It means I know exactly what you saw, and it means I know you lied. Patel extracted documents and spread them methodically across the table. You held access to secrets that 99% of Americans will never lay eyes on. You saw intelligence capable of preventing terror attacks and information that safeguards our soldiers abroad. Yet, you used that clearance as a prop, a shield, and a political weapon to deceive the American people about what you had seen. Patel then produced a thick stack of transcripts. You went on Meet the Press and told Chuck Todd you had seen evidence that was not purely circumstantial. He pulled another transcript, noting a Face the Nation appearance where Schiff told John Dickerson the proof was substantial. It was the same performance on CNN, MSNBC, and ABC repeating the claim that you had seen the evidence. Millions of Americans believed you because you were the Intelligence Committee chairman. Why wouldn't they believe you when you had the clearance and the access? Patel's voice dropped lower, which somehow made his words impact with more devastating force. They trusted you, and you betrayed that trust. The phrase, "Where's your evidence?" was already trending on social media before Patel had even repeated it. Schiff attempted to mount a defense, retreating to the talking points that had shielded him for years. I had access to classified information that I was unable to discuss in a public forum. Exactly, Patel interrupted. You could not discuss it. Yet you claimed it existed. You told the country to trust you because you had seen things they could not, asserting it proved the president was a traitor. Patel continued, relentless yet maintaining his professional composure. You did not speak of suggestions, patterns, or implications, but specifically of evidence. You used that specific word hundreds of times, promising the public it would prove collusion. He held up an official bureau document for the cameras. No intelligence product provided to the committee ever established evidence of conspiracy or coordination between the Trump campaign and the Russian government. He looked up at Schiff. You viewed the same intelligence I see now as director, the same intelligence Mueller reviewed, and the same files Durham investigated for 4 years. He paused to let the reality sink in. There was no evidence, and you lied. Senator, do you know why the American people have lost faith in the intelligence community? It is because you utilized classified briefings as a shield to levy accusations you could never prove. You told them their president was compromised based on secrets they were forbidden to see, promising them proof that simply never existed. Patel opened his second folder, which was noticeably thicker than the first. He held it up to ensure the cameras caught the label. Mueller Report. Have you read this, Senator? Of course I have, Schiff scoffed. Then you are aware of its conclusion. Patel flipped the report to a bookmarked page. The investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government. He set the report down with a thud. Did not establish is legal terminology for did not find, which is essentially legal language for did not exist. He then displayed a split-screen graphic on the monitors in the hearing room. The left side displayed quotes from the Mueller report, stating no evidence was found, while the right side displayed Schiff's quotes after the report's release. You claimed you had seen proof. That was more than circumstantial. One of these sources is lying, Senator. Either Robert Mueller is lying, or you lied on national television for 3 years to millions of citizens. Patel's tone shifted, taking on a slightly mocking edge. Senator, you continued to lie even after the country could read the report for themselves. The networks continued to give you a platform, and you continued to recite the same falsehoods. He looked directly at Schiff. You know what that makes you? They call you Pencil Neck, but the moniker Pinocchio is more fitting, all lies and no substance. Patel opened his third folder, the thickest one of all. The Durham report was released last year, and you were censured just weeks later. That is not ancient history, Senator. That is the consequence of your actions catching up to you. Durham also uncovered something fascinating regarding the origin of the collusion narrative. He read from the page, the Clinton campaign created and disseminated allegations about Trump-Russia collusion to damage her political opponent. You want to discuss inappropriate conduct, so let us discuss yours specifically. Let's look at June 21st of last year. He held up a document with congressional letterhead, the bold text reading, House Resolution 521. This is the official censure of Adam Schiff. It states that for years, Representative Adam Schiff abused his trust by alleging he had evidence of collusion that never existed. The resolution lists 43 specific instances of you making false statements about evidence you claimed to possess. He stared at Schiff. 43 times, documented on the record. Your colleagues read them into the congressional record. It took 12 full minutes just to read the list of your lies. Senator, I will ask you one final time, with the world watching and the press listening. You spent 3 years claiming you had seen the evidence. Mueller looked for years and found none. The Senate Intelligence Committee investigated for years and found none. Durham investigated for 4 years and found it was a hoax. The Inspector General investigated and found FBI abuse but no collusion. The House formally censured you for lying about it. Every investigation, every report, and every conclusion points to no evidence. He planted his hands firmly on the table and leaned forward. So I will ask you one final time, Senator. He paused for a long moment, letting the tension in the room build to a breaking point. Where is your evidence? Schiff did not answer. In fact, he could not answer. His mouth opened once, closed, then opened again, but no sound emerged. Patel nodded slowly. The silence is your answer. You have none, and you never did. Patel gathered his materials, stood up, and buttoned his jacket. Thank you for your time, committee. I have answered the senator's questions regarding my qualifications, my tenure, and my integrity. I hope I have been clear. He looked one last time at Schiff. I yield back my time, Mr. Chairman. He sat down, calm, professional, and absolutely devastating. As the room cleared for a recess, one fact was undeniable. Adam Schiff had arrived at this hearing to destroy Kash Patel's credibility. Instead, he had reminded America exactly why he had been censured, while Kash Patel had just solidified his status as a hero to conservatives nationwide. The phrase, "Where's your evidence?" trended for 3 consecutive days. The numbers told the entire story. The hearing video garnered 50 million views in 48 hours. The specific clip of the question hit 100 million views, while the Pinocchio exchange racked up 80 million. 2 weeks following the hearing, Kash Patel addressed the press. I do not regret bringing evidence to a hearing. That is the function of the FBI. We investigate, we document, and we present facts. If that makes some people uncomfortable, perhaps they should ask themselves why facts make them uncomfortable. The fallout from the hearing did not dissipate with the news cycle as the establishment had hoped. Instead of fading away, the confrontation metastasized into a full-blown war between the old guard and the new bureau leadership. Inside the Beltway, the mood shifted from nervous anticipation to palpable panic as senior officials realized their usual playbook of deflection was no longer effective. The Sunday morning shows, usually safe harbors for establishment narratives, struggled to spin the footage of a sitting senator being dismantled with his own words. Anonymous sources immediately began working the phones, flooding the inboxes of friendly reporters with whispers about Patel's alleged recklessness. By Monday morning, the coordinated counterattack arrived in the form of a blistering front-page exposé accusing the director of endangering national security. The article cited unnamed intelligence officials who claimed Patel's use of documents at the hearing was a political stunt that compromised sensitive sources and methods overseas. It was a classic Washington hit job, designed to shift the conversation from Schiff's proven lies to Patel's supposed volatility. The cable news pundits seized on the story with relief, finally having a narrative stick they could use to beat back the momentum of the hearing. They demanded his resignation before the ink was even dry, claiming the Bureau was spiraling into chaos under his leadership. Patel sat in his office on the 7th floor of the J. Edgar Hoover building, reading the print edition with a faint, knowing smile. He had anticipated this move the moment he walked out of the Senate hearing room, knowing that a wounded animal is most dangerous when cornered. They had walked right into the trap he had set, baiting them into accusing him of the very leaking tactics they had perfected for years. He buzzed his assistant and ordered a press briefing for that afternoon, specifically inviting the journalists who had bylined the morning's hit piece. It was time to show the public the difference between a leak designed to manipulate and a declassification designed to inform. The briefing room was standing room only, crackling with the aggressive energy of a press corps smelling blood in the water. Reporters shouted questions before he even reached the podium, demanding to know why he had allegedly burned intelligence assets for a viral moment. Patel waited for the noise to subside, his demeanor unchanged from the Senate hearing, radiating that same infuriating calmness. "You all wrote stories this morning based on anonymous leaks claiming I compromised classified information," he began, holding up the newspaper. "It is interesting that your sources expressed such concern for security while simultaneously leaking classified details to you to write this political hit piece." He signaled to an aide who projected a digital timeline onto the screen behind him, showing the exact chain of custody for the documents in question. "The information I released was declassified through proper channels 3 months ago, meaning your anonymous sources lied to you to generate a scandal. But here is the part that should actually interest you," he said, pointing to a highlighted timestamp on the screen. "We traced the digital footprint of the leak that informed your story this morning, and it did not come from within the FBI. It originated from a secured device registered to a senior staffer on the Senate Judiciary Committee, sent at 2 in the morning. The room fell into a stunned silence as the implication landed. The very people accusing him of leaking had leaked the accusation itself. "You are being played," Patel said, leaning into the microphone, used as pawns in a disinformation campaign to distract from the fact that they have no evidence. He turned and walked off the stage without taking a single question, leaving the timeline glowing on the screen behind him. The story was no longer about his resignation. It was about a Senate staffer potentially facing a felony charge for leaking classified material to smear an FBI director. The hunters had become the hunted, and for the first time in a long time, Washington had no idea how to rig the game. The silence that followed Patel's exit from the press briefing room was not the quiet of peace, but the suffocating vacuum that precedes a catastrophic implosion. Reporters stared at the glowing timeline left on the screen, the timestamps condemning the very narrative they had spent all morning constructing. Inside the Beltway, phones began to vibrate in unison as editors, producers, and political operatives realized the hunter had just become the hunted. This was no longer a story about a rogue FBI director. It was a criminal investigation into the Senate Judiciary Committee itself. The air in the room shifted from aggression to self-preservation, as journalists realized their anonymous source was likely about to face a federal indictment. Back on the 7th floor of the J. Edgar Hoover building, Kash Patel walked through the security doors with the rhythmic cadence of a man who had already played this scenario out in his head a dozen times. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting long shadows down the hallways that had, for decades, harbored the deepest secrets of the American government. Agents and analysts stopped their conversations as he passed, some looking at the floor in fear, others watching him with a sparked glimmer of long-suppressed hope. The bureaucracy of the FBI is a living organism, resistant to change and hostile to outsiders, but Patel was not an outsider anymore. He was the antibody sent to cure the infection. He entered his office and bypassed the celebratory pleasantries of his small inner circle, immediately pointing to the secure line that connected directly to the Department of Justice. "We need to secure the server logs from the Senate side before they have a chance to scrub the metadata," Patel ordered, his voice devoid of triumph, focused entirely on the procedural warfare ahead. The leak didn't just come from a staffer's personal phone. It came from a device connected to the Senate's secure internal network, which makes it a violation of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. He sat behind the heavy mahogany desk that had belonged to directors who believed they were untouchable, placing his hands flat on the cool wood. This was the pivot point, the moment where he had to transition from exposing the corruption to surgically removing it without killing the host. If he moved too fast, the media would successfully brand him a dictator. If he moved too slow, the swamp would regroup and drown him in litigation. Across town, the atmosphere in Senator Schiff's office was frantic, resembling the bridge of a sinking ship where the captain refuses to admit the hull has been breached. Staffers were shredding paper not out of protocol, but out of a primal instinct to eliminate anything that could be weaponized in a subpoena. The senator himself sat in his private study, the blinds drawn tight against the afternoon sun, watching the cable news chyron cycle through the revelation of the leak. He had survived impeachment trials, ethics investigations, and censure, but those were political battles fought with rhetoric. This was a criminal predicate involving digital forensics. The terrifying reality for Schiff was that he didn't know which of his aides had sent the text, or if he had inadvertently authorized it during a frantic strategy session. By Tuesday morning, the narrative war had shifted into a chaotic stalemate, with the establishment media attempting to pivot from the leak itself to the unprecedented aggression of the FBI investigating the legislative branch. They brought out former attorneys general and retired agency heads to warn somberly that Patel was breaking the norms of separation of powers. It was a coordinated symphony of concern designed to provide air cover for the Senate while they figured out a legal strategy to block the FBI's access to their servers. But Patel had anticipated this institutional stonewalling and had prepared a secondary offensive that relied on the one thing they couldn't classify: their own budget. He convened a meeting with the Bureau's finance division, a group of accountants who were used to being ignored, and gave them a directive that would freeze the blood of every career bureaucrat in Washington. "We are going to audit every special access program and off-book investigation currently being run by the Counterintelligence Division," he announced, dropping a thick binder on the conference table. "I want to know exactly how much taxpayer money was spent on the Russia collusion probe, down to the price of the coffee and the flights to London. We aren't just going to declassify the documents, we are going to declassify the receipts, because nothing angers the American taxpayer more than seeing their money used to fund a hoax." The accountants looked at one another, realizing that this director wasn't just interested in arrests. He was interested in dismantling the financial infrastructure that allowed the deep state to operate in the shadows. This was administrative warfare, unsexy and tedious, but infinitely more destructive than any press conference could ever be. As the week wore on, the pressure inside the FBI headquarters reached a boiling point, with mid-level managers resigning in protest, or perhaps in anticipation of what the audits would reveal. Patel accepted every resignation immediately, refusing to engage in the traditional exit interviews, simply signing the paperwork and revoking their security clearances within the hour. The message was clear. There would be no golden parachutes, no consulting gigs with defense contractors, and no retention of classified access for those who fled the ship. The seventh floor, once the exclusive club of the untouchables, was becoming a ghost town, populated only by Patel's hand-picked team and the few career agents who had quietly kept their heads down for years. It was during this purge that a young analyst from the cyber division knocked nervously on the director's door, holding a tablet that contained the smoking gun they had been hunting for. "Director, we managed to cross-reference the timestamp of the leak with the geolocation data from the Senate Wi-Fi logs," the analyst said, his voice trembling slightly at the magnitude of what he was presenting. The device that sent the text to the New York Times wasn't just inside the Senate building. It was inside the sensitive compartmented information facility, the Schiff. This meant the leaker had brought a personal device into a secure area, photographed a classified document, and transmitted it over an open cellular network. It was not just a leak. It was a gross security violation that carried a mandatory prison sentence, regardless of political affiliation. Patel looked at the data, the cold blue light of the screen illuminating a face that had become the nightmares of the Washington establishment. "Prepare the referral to the Department of Justice, but do not send it to the main division. Send it directly to the National Security Division with a copy to the Inspector General. We are going to follow the book so closely that they will choke on the binding," Patel said, standing up and walking to the window that overlooked Pennsylvania Avenue. He knew that by the time the sun set, the specific identity of the staffer would be known, and Schiff would be forced to choose between protecting his subordinate or saving himself. The loyalty of the swamp is transactional, and Patel was about to drive the price of that loyalty so high that no one could afford to pay it. The game was no longer about public opinion. It was about prisoner's dilemma, and he was isolating the players one by one. The reaction from the Hill was immediate and nuclear, with the Senate Judiciary Committee threatening to hold Patel in contempt if he did not cease his intimidation tactics against legislative staff. They issued a subpoena for him to appear again, this time in a closed-door session where the cameras of C-SPAN could not protect him, and where the narrative could be controlled by selective leaks. It was a trap, a classic ambush, designed to corner him in a room without witnesses, accuse him of perjury, and bind him in legal knots for the next 2 years. Patel's response was to release an open letter to the committee chairman, declining the closed-door invitation and demanding that any further testimony be held in public, live-streamed, and under oath. He cited the committee's own recent history of leaking as the justification, effectively using their corruption as the shield to protect his transparency. Friday arrived with the heaviness of a storm front, the kind of humidity that makes the marble of the monuments sweat, mirroring the anxiety of the Capitol's ruling class. The media had stopped reporting on the leak and had pivoted to a new, manufactured scandal involving Patel's past financial records, a desperate attempt to throw mud, hoping something would stick. They dug up old tax returns, interviewed disgruntled former roommates, and scoured his elementary school records. But the desperation of the attacks only served to validate his effectiveness. Patel ignored the noise, focusing instead on the declassification order that sat on his desk, a single sheet of paper that would authorize the release of the unredacted EC, or electronic communication, that started the Crossfire Hurricane investigation. The document proved that there was never a valid predicate to open the case, confirming that the entire operation had been illegal from its inception. He picked up his pen, a simple ballpoint that cost less than $1, and hovered it over the signature line that would erase years of lies. This signature would not just release a document, it would indict an era, proving that the institutions entrusted with the nation's safety had been weaponized against the people's choice. He signed it with a flourish, the ink settling into the paper with the permanence of history, and handed it to his deputy. Upload it to the public vault immediately. No embargo for the press. No preview for Congress. Just raw access for the American people. He wanted the citizens to be the first to see the truth, bypassing the filters of the pundits who would inevitably try to tell them what to think. When the document hit the server, the FBI's public website crashed within 30 seconds, overwhelmed by millions of requests from around the globe. It was a digital stampede, a testament to the hunger for truth that had been starved by years of gaslighting and redacted narratives. Across the country, independent journalists and citizens began dissecting the file, crowdsourcing the analysis in real time, highlighting the inconsistencies that the legacy media had ignored for years. The text revealed that the intelligence used to start the probe was nothing more than bar talk and circular reporting, laundered through foreign agencies to give it the veneer of credibility. The dam had finally broken, and the floodwaters were rising fast around the feet of those who had built their careers on the lie. Adam Schiff was silent on social media for the first time in years, his usually active feed dormant as his legal team scrambled to assess the exposure. The release of the electronic communication directly contradicted his claims from the 2018 memo, proving definitively that he had access to information showing the investigation was baseless, yet he claimed the opposite. The Pinocchio nickname that Patel had used in the hearing was no longer just an insult. It was becoming a legal categorization of fraud against the government. Whispers began to circulate in the cloakrooms of the Capitol that Schiff was becoming a liability, a radioactive element that could poison the entire party's chances in the midterms if not contained. The long knives were coming out, not from the Republicans, but from his own side, as the instinct for political survival overrode the bonds of partisan loyalty. Patel did not take a victory lap. Instead, he instructed his team to prepare the next tranche of documents, focusing on the FISA warrant applications. He knew that the only way to win this war was to maintain a relentless operational tempo, denying the opposition the time to regroup or formulate a counter-narrative. He was operating inside their decision loop, acting faster than their committees could meet, faster than their editors could write, and faster than their lawyers could file motions. The FBI building, once a fortress that protected the secrets of the powerful, had been transformed into a lighthouse, illuminating the dark corners where corruption bred. The morale among the rank-and-file agents began to shift perceptibly, as honest investigators realized that for the first time in years, leadership had their backs against the politicians. That weekend, Patel flew commercial to a field office in the Midwest, bypassing the government jets that directors usually commandeered for personal convenience. He walked through the airport terminal without a security detail, carrying his own bag, shaking hands with travelers who recognized him from the viral clips. It was a calculated move to show that he was not of Washington, that he did not fear the people he served, and that he did not require the trappings of imperial power to command respect. In the field office, he met with agents who worked on child trafficking and counterterrorism, the real work of the Bureau that had been neglected while headquarters chased political ghosts. He told them that the era of political policing was over, that their mission was to protect the Constitution, not the reputation of the ruling party. Back in D.C., the Senate Judiciary Committee was preparing a desperate maneuver to defund the office of the director, inserting a rider into the must-pass spending bill. It was the nuclear option, a legislative attempt to starve Patel out of office by cutting off the electricity to his suite. But they had underestimated his knowledge of the appropriations process. Patel had already identified a discretionary fund seized from asset forfeitures in cartel cases. He could legally use these funds to operate his office for 2 years without a single dime from Congress, a contingency he had discovered during his days as a prosecutor. When the threat was leaked to the press, Patel's office simply released a screenshot of the asset forfeiture balance, captioning it, "Funded by the cartels you failed to stop." The humiliation of the establishment was becoming absolute, a slow-motion collapse of their perceived authority. The Sunday talk shows were somber, with hosts looking tired and defeated, struggling to maintain the facade that Patel was the villain when the evidence of their own corruption was trending on every platform. They tried to pivot to process crimes, arguing that the way Patel released the documents was improper, but the public no longer cared about the process. They cared about the truth. The spell that had held the American mind in a state of suspended disbelief was breaking, shattered by the steady, calm, relentless application of facts. And in the center of the storm, Kash Patel worked quietly, preparing the third folder, the one he had not yet opened, the one that contained the names not of the politicians, but of the intelligence officials who had given the orders. The realization that Patel was targeting the permanent bureaucracy, the lifers who actually ran the government, sent a tremor of genuine terror through the intelligence community. Politicians come and go, but the deputy directors and the division chiefs stay for decades, accumulating power and secrets that make them untouchable. Patel was now threatening to expose the mechanism itself, to reveal how the gears of the machine were greased with illegal warrants and unauthorized surveillance. Late one night, a secure phone in Patel's office rang, a line that had not been used since he took the job. It was a voice from the past, a former mentor from the intelligence world, calling to offer a friendly warning that he was flying too close to the sun. "Kash, you have made your point," the voice said, smooth and paternal, masking the threat in concern. "But if you release the unmasking requests, you will burn bridges that can never be rebuilt. There are people who view that as a declaration of war." Patel listened, his eyes fixed on the city lights of Washington, D.C., a city built on compromise and capitulation. "I didn't come here to build bridges," Patel replied, his voice cold and final. "I came here to drain the moat." He hung up the phone, severing the last tie to the old world, and pulled the file on the unmasking of General Michael Flynn. The war was far from over. In fact, the first shots of the real revolution were just about to be fired. The release of the unmasking list did not happen with a press conference or a fanfare of trumpets, but with the silent digital hum of a server upload at precisely 3 in the morning. Patel chose the dead of night to ensure that the morning news cycle would wake up to a fait accompli, preventing the networks from coordinating their spin before the public saw the raw data. The document, simply titled Unmasking Log, Transition Period 2016-2017, contained 39 names of high-ranking officials who had requested the identity of an American citizen caught in surveillance intercepts. Among the names listed were the former vice president, the CIA director, the FBI director, and the ambassador to the United Nations, all of whom had previously denied knowing anything about the investigation into General Flynn. It was irrefutable proof that the apex of the previous administration had been intimately involved in surveilling their political successors, using the vast apparatus of foreign intelligence to spy on a domestic rival. The reaction in Washington was not just panic. It was a collective psychological break within the establishment, as the firewall between political operation and intelligence collection incinerated instantly. By 7 o'clock a.m., the cable news green rooms were scenes of chaotic shouting matches, with producers screaming into headsets as guests refused to go on air to defend the indefensible. The "it was just a routine inquiry" narrative collapsed under the weight of the timestamps, which showed the requests spiking dramatically in the final days before the inauguration. Patel sat in his office, drinking black coffee, watching the monitors as the talking heads stuttered through the list of names, their faces betraying the realization that the conspiracy theory they had mocked was actually a conspiracy of fact. He had not just caught them in a lie, he had caught them in a felony, specifically the misuse of the National Security Agency's minimization procedures for political gain. The Department of Justice, usually the shield that protected the bureaucracy, was now paralyzed by the internal realization that their own leadership was implicated in the document dump. The current Attorney General, a man known for his ability to make scandals disappear, found himself unable to reach Patel, whose office lines had been forwarded to a voicemail box that simply said, "The director is working." In the hallways of the Hoover Building, the atmosphere had shifted from fear to a strange electric sense of duty, as agents realized the seventh floor was no longer protecting the powerful but exposing them. Patel had effectively decapitated the shadow leadership of the Bureau without firing a single shot, using their own paper trail as the guillotine. But the empire would not fall without a final, desperate counterattack, and it came in the form of a heavily redacted court order from a secret FISA court judge. Around noon, a courier from the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court arrived with a sealed envelope demanding the immediate cessation of all declassifications under threat of federal imprisonment for contempt. It was a judicial gag order signed by a judge who had signed the original warrants against the Trump campaign, a desperate attempt to use the veil of national security to hide their own malpractice. Patel read the order, his expression unreadable, and then did something that would be taught in law schools for a century as the moment the executive branch reclaimed its authority. He handed the order to his general counsel and instructed him to frame it, then dictated a memo to the judge stating that the Article 2 authority of the president to declassify information supersedes the statutory authority of a FISA court to hide it. He was betting his freedom on a constitutional hardline, daring the judicial branch to send U.S. Marshals to arrest the FBI director for releasing the truth. The standoff created a constitutional crisis that the media could no longer ignore, forcing them to cover the substance of the dispute rather than just the personality of the director. Legal scholars appeared on television, arguing over the nuances of classification authority. But the American people saw a much simpler picture: a judge trying to silence a man who was showing them the crime scene. By mid-afternoon, protests began to form outside the FBI headquarters, not against Patel, but in support of him, a sight that had never been seen in the history of the Bureau. Flags waved, and chants of "Release the files" echoed off the concrete canyon of Pennsylvania Avenue, reaching the ears of the legislators huddling in the Capitol. Schiff and his allies watched from their office windows, realizing that the mob they had always counted on to intimidate their enemies had turned and was now demanding their accountability. Sensing that the legal threats were failing, the deep state played its final kinetic card: a security review of Patel's clearance, initiated by the CIA. The goal was to technically strip him of his ability to view the documents he was releasing, creating a bureaucratic paradox where the director could not legally enter his own office. It was a petty, vindictive move designed to humiliate him and halt the workflow. But Patel had already anticipated the interagency warfare. He had invoked a little-known provision of the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act, effectively deputizing a team of civilian forensic auditors with temporary clearances that the CIA could not revoke. He wasn't just fighting them, he was outmaneuvering them using the very labyrinthine rules they had written to keep outsiders out. The auditors were not DC insiders. They were forensic accountants from the private sector, men and women who tracked cartel money and terrorist financing. And they were tearing through the FBI's budget with ruthless efficiency. They found millions of dollars funneled into confidential human source payments that had no documentation, effectively slush funds used to pay operatives who didn't officially exist. Patel took these financial records and cross-referenced them with the travel logs of the agents involved in the Russia investigation, building a map of corruption that spanned the globe. He discovered that FBI agents had been flying to London, Rome, and Prague on the taxpayers' dime to meet with foreign intelligence officers who were feeding them disinformation. The collusion wasn't between Trump and Russia, it was between the FBI and foreign spy agencies to frame a candidate. As the sun began to set on the Capitol, Patel prepared to leave the building, knowing that the next 24 hours would determine whether he would be arrested or vindicated. His security detail, a group of hard-eyed operators who had served with him in previous roles, tightened their formation, sensing the hostility in the environment. They knew that there were powerful men in that city who would prefer Kash Patel to have a tragic accident rather than testify again. As his SUV pulled out of the underground garage, a black sedan pulled out aggressively to block the exit, forcing the convoy to a screeching halt. It was not an assassin, but a process server from the Senate Sergeant-at-Arms, holding a subpoena that demanded the physical surrender of the unredacted binder containing the raw intelligence. Patel rolled down the window, the armored glass humming as it lowered, and looked at the terrified young man holding the paper. "Tell Senator Schiff that the binder is no longer in my possession," Patel said, his voice calm and carrying perfectly in the garage's acoustics. "Tell him that it has been transferred to the custody of the Inspector General, and that digital copies have been distributed to 3 different secure locations outside the Beltway." He motioned for his driver to move, and the convoy swept past the stunned server, leaving him holding a piece of paper that was now worthless. Patel had decentralized the leverage, ensuring that taking him out would not stop the flow of information. He had become a hydra, and cutting off one head would only release more files. The destination was not his home, but a secure safe house in Northern Virginia, where he was scheduled to meet with the only person in the administration who could authorize the next phase, the president. The meeting was off the books. No logs, no aides, just the 2 men who had been the primary targets of the greatest political hoax in American history. Patel entered the study, placing a single thin folder on the desk, the contents of which were so sensitive they had never been digitized. "Mr. President," Patel said, remaining standing, "we have the unmasking, we have the financials, and we have the communications." He paused, looking at the man who had survived 2 impeachments. "But this folder contains the wiretap authorization for your private residence." The revelation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The confirmation that the sitting government had bugged the home of the opposition candidate was the crossing of a Rubicon from which the Republic might never return. The president opened the folder, reading the warrant application that relied on a circular news report he knew to be false. "They didn't just listen to my calls," the president murmured, his eyes scanning the technical details of the surveillance package. "They tapped the Wi-Fi, the smart devices, everything." Patel nodded solemnly. "They turned your own home into a listening post, sir, and they did it with the approval of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court." "Release it," the president said, closing the folder with a snap that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Burn it all down, Kash, before they do it to the next guy." Patel took the folder back, securing it in his briefcase, understanding that he had just been given the order to essentially declare war on the intelligence community. This was no longer about vindication. It was about sterilization, about cauterizing a wound that was rotting the heart of the democracy. He left the safe house and signaled his team to initiate Protocol Zero, the total declassification of the Crossfire Hurricane source documents. Back at the FBI, the resistance within the ranks was crumbling as mid-level supervisors realized that their bosses were likely going to prison. The blue wall of silence was fracturing, with agents reaching out to the Inspector General's office to cut deals, offering testimony in exchange for immunity. They told stories of altered 302 forms, of exculpatory evidence being hidden in burn bags, and of direct orders to ignore leads that exonerated the target. The floodgates of truth were opening, and the sewage of a decade of corruption was pouring out into the streets of Washington. The media, realizing they had been complicit in the cover-up, began to fracture as well, with younger reporters rebelling against their editors, demanding to cover the story that was unfolding before their eyes. Schiff, sensing the ground collapsing beneath him, went on television that night, his eyes wide and frantic, claiming that Patel was a rogue asset, acting on behalf of foreign powers to dismantle the U.S. intelligence capability. It was a projection so transparent that even the anchors seemed uncomfortable, shifting in their seats as he ranted about compromised sources. "He is destroying the FBI," Schiff shouted, his voice cracking. "He is selling out our spies." But the American public wasn't buying it anymore. The metrics on social media showed a 90% negative sentiment toward the senator. The narrative had flipped. The villain was now the man screaming about treason, and the hero was the quiet man with the documents. The next morning, the binder went live, a massive dump of raw intelligence that included the text messages between the lead investigators. The texts were not just unprofessional, they were hateful, detailing a plot to stop the candidate at all costs, describing an insurance policy in case he won. The phrase insurance policy trended globally within minutes, becoming the epitaph of the Bureau's credibility. Americans read the words of the people who were supposed to be neutral arbiters of justice and saw only partisan hacks with badges. The illusion of the impartial G-man was dead, killed by the arrogance of Peter Strzok and Lisa Page, and buried by the relentless transparency of Kash Patel. Patel watched the fallout from his office, but he did not smile, for he knew that the most dangerous phase was just beginning. The release of the documents was the easy part. The prosecutions would be the war. He picked up the phone and dialed the number for the United States Attorney in Durham's office, the only prosecutor he trusted to handle the radioactive fallout. "It's done," Patel said simply. "The evidence is public. Now you have the jurisdiction to convene the grand jury." The silence on the other end was heavy with the weight of history. "Send over the files, Director," the voice replied. "Let's finish this." As the grand jury subpoenas began to fly, the city of Washington descended into a state of paranoia not seen since the days of Watergate. Lawyers who had spent their careers making deals were suddenly informing their clients that there were no deals to be had. The Kash Patel rules applied: total cooperation or total prosecution. There was no middle ground, no plea bargain for a misdemeanor to hide a felony. The cleaning of the Augean stables had begun, and the river Patel was diverting to wash it out was the unrelenting force of the truth. But amidst the victory, a new threat emerged from the shadows of the international intelligence community. The Five Eyes partners, specifically British intelligence, were panicked that their role in framing the candidate would be exposed in the unredacted files. A diplomatic cable arrived at the State Department, marked Flash Priority, warning that further declassification would rupture the special relationship, and endanger intelligence sharing. It was a bluff, a threat to blind the U.S. to terrorist threats if Patel didn't stop exposing their crimes. Patel read the cable and realized the corruption wasn't just domestic. It was a transnational syndicate of intelligence services protecting each other. He sat down at his computer and drafted a response, not to the British, but to the American people, preparing a statement that would address the foreign interference directly. "We do not value an alliance that is based on the mutual subversion of our democracies," he typed. "If the price of intelligence sharing is the surrender of our sovereignty to spies, then the price is too high." He was preparing to take on the world, armed only with the truth and the unwavering support of a citizenry that had finally seen behind the curtain. The deep state had thrown everything at him: leaks, threats, subpoenas, and smears, and he was still standing, holding the folders that everyone said didn't exist. The storm had arrived, and its name was cash.